Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business. From Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. And I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years of leading responsible business issues inside the European Parliament, I host our discussions about the latest developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, we've often heard the refrain, accountants can save the planet. But in his strapline to his new book, The Accounting Paradox, author Jeremy Nicholls adds the strapline, how financial accounting is damaging the world. I've known Jeremy as founder and long-standing chief executive of Social Value International, helping to advance understanding of the social impact of business. His book, as well as the rest of his work, also very much looks for solutions, adding that accountancy can help repair the world too. I'm delighted that Jeremy Nicholls is joining us today on Frankly Speaking to discuss all of this. Jeremy, a very warm welcome.
Richard, thank you so much for inviting me. It's very good to see you. It's a long time since we've been together. And one of the things that's changed since then is I'm actually no longer the chief executive of Social Value International. I'm now an advisor to them, focusing on this work. But great to see you.
Great to see you. Now, you don't pull any punches in the book. You say accounting is a cause of climate change, nature loss and social inequality. You say it hides the way business extracts value. You equate it with corruption and counterfeiting. You say accounting encourages humankind's worst characteristics and is taking us over the edge. That's a big set of charges. We'll unpick it during our conversation. But to start with, what's the case for the prosecution?
Well, it goes back to the way in which accounting decides which costs get included in the calculation of profit and which costs get excluded. And that gets kind of lost, I think, in many of the conversations we have or the ways we think about these things. So the case for the prosecution is that costs are being excluded from the calculation of profit, which are being caused by business models. And if we were to include those costs, we would invest in different business models doing different things and have a different world.
And you've got a really interesting section that shows this isn't just about modern accountancy. It's not even about the history of accountancy from the 16th century onwards. You go back to the 11th century and look at the roots of why certain costs of business are included and certain excluded. We can't do justice to all of it, but give us a bit of an example about those historical roots to how we've got where we are today.
It's difficult to know where to start. I mean, because you can go back even further than that, and many do. But I plumped for that point because it was a point where it seemed that society, in its general approach to accountability, started to hold the kings and queens of the countries to account as well. And that was the kind of John I moment when we held him to account. And that seemed to be the point where you start to worry about the wider set in which accountability happens is a broad societal one. Accounting's just part of that. It's the part that's come in and said, well, let's hold ourselves then, individuals, to account for their trading activities. It was only subsequently that we then started to think about businesses as being separate entities. So the root cause of that history is where traders really are thinking about what was their income and what was their expenditure. And of course, at that time, quite naturally, they were personally thinking of how much they'd had to spend in order to run a business and how much they'd earned from that. And it's only over a lot of time as we start to move through those years from 1000 to 2000 and now that we start to see the systems become more complex, they become more global. There's a rise of these costs which are not being included in the calculation, which becomes much more systemic. And they're the problems we see today, whether it's climate change or the degradation of nature, or the fact that we have significant issues within supply chains around unpaid or enforced labor. These are really big costs now, which become systemic.
Then you bring it up to date and talk about how accounting standards were formed both in the US and in the rest of the world. The American Institute, you quote a very interesting story from AICPA working group in the early 1970s, where there was a choice about how accounting standards were developed, and they said it was just too difficult to calculate societal costs. They said that's an issue for society, not for accountancy. Tell us a bit about that history of how accounting standards ignored the external social
Yeah.
environmental costs?
The long history up to that point, you can broadly go, it's understandable. I mean, no one was looking at those kind of relationships. We were focusing on our understanding of costs on contractual responsibilities. If I've got a contract with you, I will pay you. If I don't, you will take me to court and you'll be able to enforce that payment, or at least you would hope so. And so that's where we start thinking about that kind of cost. When you get the first standards, there's this extraordinary moment, I think, then where the conversation goes around and says, well, maybe there was something bigger than that. Maybe it isn't just about those contractual obligations. It makes a statement about not wanting to be political, but at the same time ends up being rather political in that judgment and says, well, we're going to go along with this. We're going to go along with this perspective, and hardwires at that point all that history of being able to of those costs being excluded, understandably. But I think it's the first point where you could go, we could have really made a different choice then. We could have said, we are not in a position as a group of people to say this is too hard. Actually, we do need to get representatives of the government in the room when we're having these decisions. We need to get representatives, even perhaps of the people who experience those consequences, the harm that's being done to them, and they need to be part of this conversation. Unfortunately, what happened was that group of people kind of rode over that, I suppose, and again, to some extent, maybe understandably, decided to run ahead with a view of what the expectations of investors and users of accounts was, that said their expectation was financial returns. And this is the bit where we go, that sounds so reasonable, but of course, what it does is it says financial returns and nothing else, and financial returns without any other caveats. And effectively, it means that we're having financial returns as if we are not interested in any of the other consequences. And that's the bit where they solidify the purpose of accounting around a sense of users' expectation being limited to financial returns. And that's the bit where I think we hardwire in the problems that we now face. It's deep. We lose sight of it. Most of the time when I speak to people about accounting, they think it's just income and expenditure and it's all very boring. But that's the point at which we frame which costs are going to be included and which costs are not.
The argument that externalities should be internalised is a very simple argument. When I read the book, I thought it's the clarion call of the book. You discuss it in a really interesting way. You use accountancy terms and concepts as speaking a language that accountants could relate to, as well as the rest of the world. And so I'm hoping it can be persuasive, of course. But it was the 1920s and Arthur Pigou, the economist, who first put the case for internalising externalities. There's a whole history to that argument. There's even an International Monetary Fund paper saying it should happen. So the argument's out there. Why do you think, you obviously in writing this book, you think that now is the time. Why do you think that that argument can win now where it hasn't won for 100 years?
Partly it's the scale. I reference a report done by S&P Global on the scale of the externalities, where they actually do allocate them back to businesses and focus on the public equities, so the public stock markets. And they were estimating that the environmental externalities caused by businesses were 3.7 trillion. That doesn't include the social externalities. It doesn't include private investment. So these are very large sums. So I think one of the reasons is because the scale, the bigger the global economy, the bigger the scale of those externalities. As we grow one measure of performance, which ignores these other factors, so those other factors are busily growing in background. So it's just the scale of the problem has become so high now. I think the thing that's been missed, though, when you look at a lot of the solutions to the language of externalities, is that they're seen as something that happens after the market has done whatever the market is doing, and therefore it's up to government interventions to resolve that. And I think what I'm arguing is that what we've missed sight of is that when we say the market, we are kind of assuming this idea of where cost sits and who pays it. It gets lost within that. If we go back to that and start thinking about what is happening when those accounts are drawn up and we only accept responsibility for some of the costs, and we standardize why that is, and we bring a whole language of standards and thinking, um, that the problem gets separated from this, the fact that it's happening at the level of business decisions, which lead to those externalities. Not all of them, but a significant proportion of that challenge. And so we need to get back to the root cause if we're going to address the problem, rather than waiting for governments to try and sort it out when it's a little bit too late and they have fewer levers to actually resolve those challenges.
Yeah, you say in the book that governments can do things and do things, but that essentially getting into the profit calculation is again the big argument in the book. I, of course, and you in a way, come from the world of sustainability, which even you use the accusation against us in the book that we're too fuzzy, and so you address that one head on. But you basically fairly scathing as well about non-financial and sustainability accounting and reporting. You say the practice is a good try, even a cunning try, you add, but that it misses the point, and you describe the concept of ESG as bloodletting. Now, clearly, all of that, the work that's happened over the years has been an attempt to try and redress the balance, but you don't think it's worked. Tell us why.
Yes, that reference seems a bit harsh. It was a kind of, when we look back, it'll be bloodletting was mainly harmless, but didn't really solve the problem, and yet we all got very excited about it.
There was a lot of bloodletting in the 16th century, so it rather accords with your argument.
It does. I mean, it's not surprising that because we haven't fixed for accounting, we've tried to fix for something else. So it's a kind of natural progression that we go, the way that the economic system is working is causing all these challenges. We need to address that. So we'll leave accounting as it is because we never think about that as being really the problem. And we start to build these other solutions, of which I have been involved with for many years. As you know, a lot of that sustainability work, and most recently with the UNDP on the work we've been doing around the SDGs. But it's an additional, the risk is that it becomes another layer to the onion, and we just find another reason to hide the source code of this, the underlying problem. And that underlying problem is, as ever, that the people who experience these consequences, I mean, the bulk of the externalities are being experienced by less well-off people in less well-off parts of the world, and they do not have a voice. They do not have a voice when these kind of discussions are being had around sustainability reporting. So many of those of our efforts have been developed without adequate accountability, without inclusion of the people experiencing the consequences. And so inevitably, I think we don't see that there's a possible, the root cause is actually going back earlier in the system. So yes, it's helping us move forwards in some ways, and to the extent that it helps us recognize that we do need to do something about these consequences, it's good. But if it becomes a veneer or another way of hiding that the problem is actually in the calculation of profit, then it's bad because it's just deferring the problem.
Can I put the case against that to answer it? But starting from the Carbon Disclosure Standards Board, the International Integrated Reporting Council that I was involved with, we were really trying to integrate and to see the trade-offs between financial performance of the company and social, environmental, broader costs. And now, we've got the International Sustainability Standards Board, and if they were sitting here, they would say, well, we're precisely looking at the financial consequences of sustainability and the connectivity between that and, well, let me put that their argument for them. They are looking at the social environmental impact of business and then the financially material cost that it has backwards, back on the company. And you could argue that they're doing precisely what you're asking to be done. They're looking at how externalities impact profits. So why isn't that sufficient in your view?
The language we've grown up to use on this, and we, you and I have both been part of that, when we talk about sustainability issues, we talk about impacts and dependencies, we talk about externalities. The reality is that all those words are masking the fact that harm has been done to people who have not been compensated for that harm that has been done to them, people and the planet. And all those efforts at the moment are not compensating for the harm that has been done. So consequently, the price signals that we're getting to investment flows allow the current profits to be the same with the associated harm that's being done, and sort of focus more on the efforts that will be made in the future to reduce that. If you really want to shift investments at the rate we need them into business models which are not generating externalities, then we need to start compensating for that harm and treating it as a cost of doing business. We'd accept those legal obligations quite happily to pay our wages and to pay our suppliers because they're backed by a legal obligation. But the amazing thing about accounting, one of the most brilliant things about accounting, is that it allows directors to construct an obligation and take responsibility for situations where there has not been a legal contract. And there's nothing to stop them accepting responsibility for the harm that has been done, which is not contracted, and paying for that harm and compensating for it. So I think the price signaling issue, the ethical issues around that, the fact that we should see these just as normal businesses, all add up to the fact that taking responsibility, treating this as a cost of doing business, will shift our business models and our economy far faster and far more in line with not only what we need globally, but in line with the expectations of people suffering those consequences than our other current approaches are doing, which in the end are allowing ourselves to use language to hide the fact that that harm is being done and not compensate.
And very much, as you say in the book, that's the third pillar of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the
Very
redress,
much remedy. Yes.
the remedy. Um, what I would say, though, is when I read your argument on that, it very much brought it back to the difference between single and double materiality. That the difficulty with just relying on what the ISSB is doing is that it's about impact on company profits. It's nothing to do with impact, let alone compensation to wider communities. And so for people who struggle with that single double materiality
I
choice,
struggle with it as well, but for other wider reasons. Maybe we'll get
that
to them. But
that might help.
if you compensate for the harm you're doing and you pay for it, and you pay for that, then you've conflated the two. They just collapse into one.
Mm.
That responsibility to compensate for harm might be called double, and if it's in your financial accounts, it might be called single. But if you're suddenly paying for that harm that's been done, they're one and the same.
And they're in the accounts. There's a
Yes.
lot of discussion about terrible inequality in your book and about power, and in your language, won't business, which always argues against anything that might load more cost onto it, which is powerful, won't powerful business elites just successfully lobby and argue against this, and it's never going to see the light of day? How can that be overcome?
Yeah, there is a challenge there, obviously. In terms of the conversations that we've been having around this, there's definitely a sense when you talk to purpose-led businesses that they go, well, we've had directors saying, I didn't realize you could do this. It would align my personal values with the business. I think if you look at the mix, this is why my history is very much about a broader sense of accountability than just accounting. Because if you look at the wider frame, we have businesses operating in order to provide goods and services to people in the world. And so there's always been this public interest behind it. There's a public interest behind accounting, the systems that we put in place, the institutions all operate for a wider public interest. We don't think that public interest, or I don't think that public interest is being met with the existing approach to calculating profit. Those existing business models will obviously have a conflict of interest within sustaining those abilities. And to some extent, we all do if we have pensions. We're all kind of expecting those returns. But if you want to align public and private interests and not have governments having to raise taxes to deal with the externalities caused by some business models, to kind of picking up the tab on that, then we need to bring them together. And then we have a competitive economy. And the brilliant thing about the competitive economy is that it holds businesses to account for that overarching value. And if they're not driving it, then businesses fail and new businesses start. If we shifted the frame within which they operate and you expect businesses to compensate for the harm doing, we would get some businesses not being able to do that and new businesses starting. And I still believe in that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, the imagination and innovation that we have as human beings to be able to come forward with business models that would be able to provide goods and services to humanity without at the same time causing ever rising costs to aspects of humanity.
Brilliant. Clarion call again for free enterprise and fair competition. So that's
Exactly. Exactly.
that perhaps listeners wouldn't have expected that in this podcast, but you put it down. Let's move to the solutions. It's a very practical book. You give there's a chapter where you talk about what directors can do, what accountants can do, what students can do, what investors can do. So there's a lot in there, but you come up with actually a relatively small number of changes to accounting frameworks and accounting standards that you say could make all the difference. One is you've just been referring to it in that answer. It's about redefining public interest. You say that also redefining the concept of what true and fair means, and true and fair has been applied to accountancy again over centuries, but you say a new interpretation there. And then you even drill down as far as the International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS conceptual framework, where you say simply adding governments as primary users, which is a very interesting suggestion, and explicitly include the previously externalised costs. It's actually quite a small shopping list of changes when you look at that. Can you take us through it and to say
Yeah.
why you think that will make all the difference?
Well, let's start with in reverse then with the conceptual framework. I mean, the accounting standards are a brilliant set of ways of dealing with uncertain, providing good information or good enough information for users to make decisions under uncertainty. And they're framed by the conceptual framework, which sets how would you apply those, which is another amazing document of kind of putting all that together. But it starts with that assumption, which came from, that history that we've chatted about a bit, of that assumption that we are interested in financial returns as being the interest of the maximum number of users. And we've just completed an international survey of 8 countries and 8,000 people to explore that underlying, of which you'll have to come back at another conversation we'll have later to talk about the results of that. But it's going to that heart of if we change that, if that was to change to not be just financial returns, but to be something else, then that would have implications for how accounting standards are applied. Given that we can already construct obligations within the accounting standards, the issue is if we were to expect that as a norm, that we did have to construct obligations in relation to any harm being done, then that would have a massive shift immediately to the system. Making that happen requires a couple of other bits in the jigsaw. I think one of them was I don't think it's that the public interest needs reframing. The public interest of most of these bodies is efficient, competitive markets. It's efficient markets. Often fair and efficient is the language used, but even if just efficient. And we do not want to have externalities and at the same time be supporting efficient markets. The fact that the exclusion of these costs opens up externalities and the difference between public and private interests is undermining the competitive market. And so there's a breakdown potentially between the public interest statements we have around efficient markets and what's actually happening on the ground. So it's really just saying we need to close that. If you are serious about that public interest, let's make that happen. Let's change that wording in the conceptual framework, or at least open up a wider public debate to what the other options would be. Government actually used to be a user in the previous conceptual framework. It was there, it got taken out in the current one. But it does seem that at the moment, and the example referred to in the book is the example of Professor Tim Jackson's work on the processed food industry, the high processed food industry, where in the UK, the profits of the 8 biggest firms in that space were about, I think, 23 billion from memory. And the costs that he estimated were being caused by that industry were about 280 billion, of which 90 billion was the direct NHS costs dealing with the health-related consequences of that food industry. And the bit I added in was the fact that in that year, the total amount of corporation tax raised in the year was 90 billion. So all the corporation tax from all businesses effectively had to be used to address the health costs of one business sector. So we're raising taxes to pay for the consequences of the harm being done in some sectors. That doesn't really make sense. And it's certainly not, if you added government back in as a user, it'd be hard to understand why their interest was limited to just financial returns, because they use those tax receipts to pay for these other costs as well. So if you bring that back into the picture, you change the kind of framing of what our expectations of our investment decisions are to be more to reconsider a wider interest of the public, and you realign the public interest, then we're very close to doing it. The other bit I would add in the kind of mix is the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, who again have their own conceptual framework, and we're getting quite geeky into the accounting standards stuff here. But it is a lovely
Some of our
conceptual
listeners are
framework.
really enjoying that, by the way,
Yeah,
so
I bet they
don't
are. That's
apologise.
all right. Well, the reason I love the international public sector accounting standards, apart from the fact that it's a significant part of the world economy, is that it starts by framing the purpose as by saying government's purpose is the enhancing and maintenance of well-being, and starts to think of a much wider sense of performance than financial returns. I mean, if we really made sure that the public sector accounting also reflected that and built in a kind of well-being accounting, I think that would be the other final piece of the jigsaw that would start to move us to a much more that integration you talked about. I think we've always been fans of integration, but I think the integration happens at the root and not afterwards, and we've integrated too late in the journey often.
And there's a big set of arguments in the book about moving to well-being economics and the well-being economy. Jeremy, you don't mention the name of one accountancy firm anywhere in the book, and you were trained a long time ago by PwC,
Yes.
but even that isn't in the book. And there's been an argument that we're both well aware of, that the big accountancy companies are too powerful, they have conflicts of interest between audit and advisory services, and then some people argue, I'm not saying I'm saying this, but some people argue that with AI taking over all the number crunching that financial accountants do, or a lot of it, the accountancy firms and sector is trying to create a market in non-financial and sustainability reporting, and then charge businesses a lot of money for doing so, which the businesses don't quite like. As I say, I don't personally advocate that, but I was surprised you didn't address that argument in the book. Was there a reason?
No, I think it's not just about the big four firms. It's about a lot of the things that happen when we are raising concerns and issues about businesses' behaviours and corporates. And there's no doubt that there's a whole wealth of recognition of the issues that some businesses are involved in, which is undermining human rights at the very best, and if not damaging and destroying them at the worst. But that doesn't mean to say that all businesses are the problem, or that it's not, again, something deeper in the system that is the issue. And so I've not really kind of gone down the route of identifying individual businesses of any sector, particularly, rather than saying that the problem's more systemic behind that. It's the way in which we have set up systems to regulate and oversee those sectors, whichever industry we're looking at. So I do talk about FRC. I do talk about FCA in the UK and the equivalent bodies internationally that oversee them, whether that's, in that kind of myriad of different organizations, which we have set up quite understandably to avoid conflicts of interest, which again potentially have lost sight of this. Where's the root problem? The root problem is that we're allowing profits to be made with harm being done. We could compensate for that, but we haven't. If we did that, that would open up a range of different business opportunities for advice for the big four firms and other firms to provide, instead of the challenge the accusation that they've got around the sustainability market. The audit, you'll probably have noticed that I'm a big fan of audit within that. Audit was a public policy issue that we set up to be a public interest. And we effectively allowed businesses to be the ones that provided that public interest recognition. That would continue to be the case. We would need to have that public interest oversight through institutions And it may well be the very best way of achieving that is to allow market recognition. Markets do not operate efficiently if there's too much concentration of power. Oligopolies undermine consumer value. That's a kind of, economics 101. So that may be that, the questions about whether there's over strength within that particular industry because of concentration of size as a monopolistic or oligopolistic issue is one for FRC to be dealing with. I think I'm more interested in the question as to whether these bodies are really delivering on the public interest by allowing profits to be made whilst not compensating for harm being done in the course of that.
Yeah, though you do say that the way that a complex myriad of regulation and oversight, which is supposedly to guarantee the public interest, forgets to involve the public. And you make the argument for an international treaty in the United Nations to oversee accounting, which I'd not heard before.
It's an interesting history, isn't it? There was a point in that kind of. I picked 73 as the date for one of the chapters because that's the date of the ISC being formed, the International Accounting Standards Committee. And that is that's a very big moment. It's not just a moment for forming and starting to think about international standardization of accounting. It's also a moment for thinking about how that would be governed. I mean, many of the other international issues that we have come under international treaties through UN bodies or others, and they were options at the time. And we've taken one route, and there is a little bit of me that does think that you would have a wider stakeholder voice involved in the accounting system if we had gone that other route, because that would have hardwired, mandated the recognition of a wider group of stakeholders experiencing the consequences of accounting and therefore needing and justifiably having a voice in their development.
Jeremy, we're moving towards the end, and I want to ask you one final question, which is a bit broader. Yeah. At the start of your book, you have an infographic which is about how all of the tenets of different world religions give advice to how you should address social impact. I'd say that, paraphrasing it, of course. You also include within that the culture of many Indigenous peoples, First Nation peoples around the world. And I have heard this before, but not very often, that the link between whether you have a moral code that could come from religion or could come from someone else, but whether you have a moral code is maybe a starting point to whether you actually do things about all of this or not. And that's not discussed very often. And you refer to the Golden Rule throughout your book. It's obviously an important argument for you. Is that because we've lost faith in society and in the world, in many parts in any case? Is that why we're failing? Do we need to actually search to the moral code that we have, any of us, if we're going to actually change anything?
That's obviously going to be part of it, but I think again the issue for me is that we've designed an accounting system which is not based on that golden rule. It's not based on do unto others as you would have others do unto yourself, because if it were, we would be compensating for the harm that we did as we went along. You'd be trying to reduce it, but you compensate for it. Whatever we are as individuals, it seems that we have built a world based on the assumption that our interest in financial returns, full stop, without considering any of these other factors, takes us down a particular set of behaviors and views and hardwires into many of the problems we have. Were we to say, well, hang on, maybe we should define our accounting system by the starting point of what's the best in us to be living by that golden rule, we would have a very different world. And we'd have one which actually the core economic performance indicator would suddenly be one which aligned with that rule, aligned with those behaviors, and would promote and support more of us becoming, kind of having those personal values. It's almost as though the disconnect between our personal values and the system's values is what we need to solve for. There are plenty of people who have those values, but they're operating within a system which actually literally does not promote that behavior. It says just, we work towards the song of financial returns without compensating for any harm. And that's the bit I'm in the end, I'm arguing to change and to align with those other norms. They are both religious norms. They are, as you say, the norms of Indigenous people around the world. they're the norms of our own legal system under tort law. When you're, that's the kind of basic starting point of that. It seems it's only the accounting system which has been off key to all those other norms.
And you call that accounting system one that is so skewed towards self-interest that it's made us all more selfish, and I think that's a moral conclusion if ever I've heard one. In this podcast we've heard that the problem of externalities being separated from internalities really has a root throughout history. It's not simply about modern accounting. We've heard that the balance of the argument to internalise externalities may be simply because of the scale of those externalities that exists today. We've heard that the shortfall, in Jeremy's view, in relation to non-financial and sustainability reporting is to make sure that there's compensation, there's remedy built into the costs. And we don't hear that said too often. But he said that the argument was very much about, if you get the accounting framework right, competition and entrepreneurialism driving the answer. In the latter part of the podcast, we talked about a small number of changes, for example, to the conceptual framework of the financial reporting standard set IFRS, which could make a big fundamental difference, Jeremy argues, including about really recognising what the public interest is. And in that last question, we discussed the golden rule and how morality and even spirituality might be part of this discussion. The Accounting Paradox is available now. It's published by Practical Inspiration Publishing, and I recommend it as a very good read. Sadly, we have come to the end of our time together, Jeremy. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you, Richard, for having me. I really enjoyed that conversation. I think you saw the end of the book. There's lots of things to do. Look forward to coming back and seeing how they're going later.
Thank you. You'll be very welcome. You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Jeremy Nicholls and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.